At 02:47 in the morning, the South China Sea was calm. No alarms, no warnings. 17 Japanese ships moved silently through the darkness. Tankers, freighters, troop ships, carrying oil, steel, and 6,000 soldiers home. They believed they were protected. 8 destroyers, radar scanning the surface, sonar listening to the depths. What they didn't know was that for more than 36 hours, something had been following them. Not ships, ghosts. At 03 Zaar, the sea exploded. By dawn, 11 ships were sinking. Over 4,000 men were dead, and Japan had begun to starve. This is the story of the war fought in silence beneath the waves. November 19th, 1944, the South China Sea. Captain Toshiro Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the cargo ship Miyasan Maru, staring into a darkness so complete it felt unnatural. Around him sailed one of the most valuable convoys Japan could assemble. 17 ships in total, oil tankers, freighters, and troop transports, packed tightly together. On board were 6,000 soldiers, and the fuel Japan desperately needed to keep its war alive. The convoy had departed Singapore 3 days earlier. Half the journey was already behind them. Yamamoto understood the danger of these waters. American submarines prowled the shipping lanes, unseen and unpredictable. Entire convoys had vanished without warning, but the escort commander had reassured him. 8 destroyers surrounded the formation. Radar scanned the surface. Sonar listened to the deep. Every known precaution had been taken. At 02:51, the lead destroyer detected a faint sonar contact. The ship turned immediately, engines roaring as the crew focused on the signal. Seconds passed, then minutes. The contact disappeared. No explosion, no follow-up. A false alarm, they concluded. The convoy resumed its course. What Japanese sonar could not detect was the truth below the surface. 4 American submarines had been stalking this convoy for more than 36 hours. They moved slowly, keeping their distance, communicating through brief radio transmissions and prearranged signals. This was not chance. It was a coordinated hunt. The submarines had tracked the convoy from Singapore, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. At exactly 03:00, the first torpedo hit. The explosion ripped through a tanker near the center of the formation. 1 minute later, 3 more torpedoes struck almost simultaneously. Ships erupted in fire. Fuel ignited. Steel hulls split open. Troop ships turned into floating infernos. In less than 3 minutes, the convoy ceased to exist as an organized force. Destroyers fired blindly into the darkness, depth charges detonating against empty water. Ships collided as captains tried to escape the chaos. Men jumped into burning seas. Screams carried across the water, then vanished beneath smoke and flame. By dawn, 11 of the 17 ships were sinking or already gone. More than 4,200 Japanese soldiers were dead. Captain Yamamoto survived. Clinging to floating debris, coated in oil, he watched as a periscope slowly broke the surface nearby. An American submarine had risen to observe the destruction it had caused. Years later, when asked to describe what haunted these waters, Yamamoto used a word whispered throughout Japan's merchant fleet: Yurei, ghosts. The Japanese called them ghosts because there was no other way to explain what was happening. Ships vanished without warning. Convoys disappeared overnight. Escorts returned alone, unable to say what they had fought. By 1944, this fear had spread through Japan's entire merchant marine. What made these attacks so devastating was not just surprise, it was planning. American submarines did not hunt randomly. They studied shipping routes, departure schedules, and convoy behavior. Patrols lasted weeks, sometimes months. Crews memorized silhouettes of enemy ships. They learned to recognize a convoy by sound alone: the slow thrum of tankers, the sharper rhythm of destroyers, the hollow echo of freighters riding low in the water. Yet despite their eventual success, American submarines entered the war completely misunderstood. Before World War II, the United States Navy believed wars would be decided by battleships. Massive fleets would meet in open water. Cannons would decide empires. Submarines, in this vision, were scouts, observers, tools meant to report enemy movements, not destroy commerce. Treaty restrictions reinforced this mindset. International agreements required submarines to surface, warn merchant ships, and allow crews to abandon ship before attacking. American planners built a submarine force for a war that would never exist. Everything changed on December 7, 1941. In less than 2 hours, Japanese aircraft destroyed the American battle line at Pearl Harbor. Battleships burned. Crews drowned inside steel hulls. The doctrine that had guided the Navy for decades collapsed in a single morning. That same afternoon, the Chief of Naval Operations sent a short message to the submarine force. It rewrote the rules of naval warfare. Execute unrestricted submarine warfare. The treaties were discarded. Merchant ships became targets. The silent service was unleashed, but there was a problem. They weren't ready. American submarines went to sea armed with torpedoes that didn't work. The Mark 14 torpedo, the Navy's primary weapon, suffered from 3 fatal flaws. It ran too deep, passing harmlessly beneath targets. Its magnetic exploder detonated prematurely, or not at all, and its contact exploder crushed on impact without triggering an explosion. Commander after commander reported perfect attack runs followed by silence. Torpedoes struck hulls and bounced off. Others circled back toward the submarines that fired them. Entire patrols returned with nothing to show for flawless execution. One commander, Dudley "Mush" Morton of USS Wahoo, fired a full spread of torpedoes at a stationary target. None exploded. His report was blunt. "I am tired of watching enemy ships sail away from dud torpedoes." The Bureau of Ordnance blamed the crews. For 18 months, the Navy refused to admit the problem was real. Submariners kept fighting with broken weapons. Men died because bureaucrats refused to accept failure. Finally, in late 1943, the torpedoes were fixed, and then the killing truly began. Once the torpedoes worked, American submarines became something entirely new. What followed was not chaos, but methodical destruction. Japan was an island empire with almost no natural resources. Oil, iron, rubber, everything had to be imported by sea. At the start of the war, Japan possessed roughly 4 million tons of merchant shipping. Economists estimated the empire needed at least 5.5 million tons just to survive. That margin would vanish beneath the waves. Submarine commanders now attacked aggressively. They stalked convoys at night, surfaced to use radar, and fired torpedoes from close range. Escorts were confused. Merchant captains panicked. Shipping losses climbed month after month. By 1944, the Navy adopted a new tactic: coordinated submarine groups. Though often compared to German wolf packs, the American version relied on patience rather than mass. Submarines shadowed convoys for days, reporting positions, waiting for weaknesses. When escorts spread thin, they struck. Convoy after convoy was savaged. One of the most aggressive commanders was Dudley "Mush" Morton. His submarine, USS Wahoo, attacked relentlessly. On a single patrol, Morton pursued a convoy for 3 days, striking again and again, refusing to disengage. 9 ships were sunk. Morton's philosophy was simple: Wahoo is expendable. In October 1943, Wahoo was lost with all hands. Morton never returned. But his methods reshaped the submarine force. Aggression was rewarded. Caution was abandoned. Another commander would take those tactics even further. Richard O'Kane of USS Tang became the most successful American submarine commander of the war. In just 5 patrols, he sank 33 ships. O'Kane preferred surface attacks at night, firing torpedoes at point-blank range before disappearing into darkness. His success came at a cost. On Tang's final patrol, its last torpedo malfunctioned. Instead of racing toward the enemy, it curved back toward the submarine that launched it. The explosion sank Tang instantly. O'Kane survived, blown clear of the bridge. He spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. Afterward, he received the Medal of Honor. By 1944 alone, American submarines sank 603 Japanese ships. 2.7 million tons of shipping disappeared in a single year. For every submarine lost, dozens of Japanese ships went down. The silent service had found its rhythm. But sinking ships was only half the story. The most terrifying part of submarine warfare wasn't attacking. The Japanese called their anti-submarine forces the submarine killers. Once a submarine was detected, the hunt was relentless. There was no victory in these encounters, only survival. For a submarine crew, being discovered meant a single brutal choice: run, dive, or go silent. Depth charges were the weapon of choice. Steel drums packed with explosives set to detonate at specific depths. They didn't need to hit directly. A near miss was enough. The shockwave could crush the pressure hull, rupture fuel tanks, or snap machinery loose from its mounts. Inside the submarine, a depth charge attack was pure psychological torture. First came silence, then the splash as the charges entered the water, then the explosion. Lights shattered, pipes burst, gauges spun wildly. The hull screamed as if it were tearing apart. Men were thrown from bunks. Equipment broke loose and slammed into steel walls. The attacks could last for hours, sometimes days. Crews learned to endure in complete darkness, whispering orders, afraid even to breathe too loudly. One mistake, a dropped tool, an engine revved too high, could mean death. Most submarines ran, but some commanders chose another path. Commander Sam Dealey of USS Harder turned defense into offense. Instead of fleeing destroyers, he hunted them. Dealey perfected what became known as the down-the-throat shot, firing torpedoes directly at a charging escort. It was suicidal, and it worked. In just 6 days, Harder sank 5 Japanese destroyers. Escorts began refusing to pursue submarines aggressively. Hunting had become lethal. The hunters were now the hunted. By mid-1944, the campaign was strangling Japan. Oil imports dropped by more than 80%. Factories shut down. Aircraft sat grounded for lack of fuel. Civilians went hungry. Military shipments never reached the front. Admiral Charles Lockwood called it Operation Starvation. Submarines were positioned across every shipping lane. Nothing moved without risk. Nothing moved without fear. By the end of the war, Japan's merchant marine had effectively ceased to exist. The empire was bleeding out, slowly, silently, beneath the sea. All that remained was the cost. It was being hunted. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the scale of the destruction was finally clear. American submarines had sunk 1,314 Japanese ships. More than half of all Japanese vessels lost during the war had been sent to the bottom by submarines alone. They had done it with just 1.6% of the United States Navy's personnel. The cost was staggering. 52 American submarines were lost. 3,500 submariners never came home, a casualty rate of 22%. The highest of any branch of the American military. For the men of the silent service, there were no victory parades. Their operations had remained classified. Their methods, unrestricted warfare, commerce raiding, starvation, were uncomfortable to celebrate. History focused instead on aircraft carriers, island invasions, and atomic bombs. The war beneath the waves faded into the background. The submariners returned home quietly. They drank. They tried to forget. Many never spoke about what they had seen. They had lived for months at a time inside steel cylinders, breathing recycled air, knowing that a single mistake or a single explosion could erase them without a trace. Today, museums like the USS Bofin preserve fragments of their story. Rusting hulls, faded photographs, lists of names carved into steel. Most people have never heard of commanders like Morton, O'Kane, or Dealey. Japanese historians, however, eventually admitted the truth. Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai testified after the war that the American submarine campaign had been the most decisive factor in Japan's defeat. Not the bombs, not the battleships. The slow strangulation of an island empire that could not survive without the sea. The Japanese had called them ghosts. Invisible, unstoppable, unexplainable. They struck without warning. They vanished without a trace. Convoys disappeared. Cities starved. An empire collapsed, not with a single blow, but with thousands of silent ones. 52 submarines never returned. Thousands of men carried the memories for the rest of their lives, and one of the most effective military campaigns in history remained largely forgotten. This is deep-sea war tales, stories of the war fought in silence, beneath the waves.